few days ago, I released the remix of my album Revelation, which I've been working on over the course of 2023, so I'm going to talk about it today. Let's take it back to the beginning. The year is 2019. Before it all happened. And late in the year, I have an idea. Let's do a concept album, metal album, covering the whole book of Revelation. That's the last book of the Bible, if you're not aware. It's the end times prophecy, if you will. You could view it that way if you want. And that's also where we get the word apocalypse, which means the same thing as Revelation. But colloquially, it means the end of the world. It's a little Greek for you. So, I'm going to do this big concept album. And of course, we all know what happens in 2020. And it seems extra fitting that year to be writing about the end times. So I do, and I have a fair bit of extra free time that year. My work was more limited, so I spent a lot of time writing this album, and it was a big album. So it was a whole lot of work. It's a whole lot of words. It was an hour worth of music. It was every part to write and record and mix it all. So it was an ambitious project. It was bigger in scope than anything I'd done before, but I had the time and I was kind of in a no expense spared type of mood. Except I didn't really spend any money on it, but in terms of time, I spent a lot of time on it. To give you an idea, the drum rehearsal alone, I spent a good hour every day playing through the whole album every day for 2 weeks before I ever hit record. And then recording was another 2 weeks or so. And I would do multiple takes of each song and then, comp the best ones. Though I think I largely ended up using kind of the best take that day, maybe comp out some sections that needed it. For the vocals, I think I recorded the entire album and all the harmonies like 3 times because every time I wasn't happy with it and I'd go back and I'd record more and then I'd kind of want to just do the whole thing. And so I would. The guitars as well. I remember I recorded about half the album before realizing that some of the pedals I was using were a little noisier than I wanted. And of course I didn't record DIs, which was stupid. And so I couldn't just reamp stuff. I had to re-record all the guitars for at least half the album worth of, 2 tracks of rhythm guitars. So it was a big endeavor. Yeah. Some of it was my fault of not being super efficient, but again, I was learning this. I mean, I'd recorded a number of albums and I'd, been in recording sessions with my band, but this was doing it all by myself and not doing just an EP with a couple of songs, but a whole hour worth of music. It ends up being, a lot more work to do an hour than 20 minutes and not just 3 times as much, if that makes sense. On top of what I was doing with the lyrics conceptually, I wanted to do a doom album by and large, though there's kind of mixes of other stuff in there, as I am wont to do, but largely a doom album where I mixed in a lot of clean parts. That was my musical concept for the album, was something largely kind of slow and heavy, but with a lot of variation in texture, in dynamics, because I felt like a lot of the music that I'd written was so focused on heavy guitars and heavy guitars all the time. I wanted to have a lot of clean guitar sections in pretty much every song. So there was a lot of contrast and dynamics in the instrumentation. I also didn't want to do anything with samples, MIDI, synths, anything like that. I wanted it all to be real instruments, acoustic instruments, except the electric guitars, but even that was real tube amps and, no amp sims, no software at all. I did use impulse responses instead of recording real cabs, but aside from that, everything was done out of the box as much as possible. And it wasn't until I got into mixing and with the vocals and stuff that I really used a whole lot of software. This also pushed me to really settle on tones and make sure that I'm happy with them, because you don't want to record an hour worth of music over the course of maybe 5, 6, 8 hours and then realize that you hate the way the guitar sounds. That would be pretty bad. And since I wasn't doing it with software, couldn't really go back and change much. And I definitely should have recorded DIs. I did record bass with a DI. I should have done the guitars with a DI. Luckily, I still don't hate the tone I captured from the amp. And thanks to the magic of impulse responses and speakers, I could change the tone pretty radically with IRs, because that's where so much of the tone comes from. I also did a fair bit of experimenting with different instrumentation in this. So I added a lot of acoustic guitar, but I also have a lot of clean electric guitar, and I have 2 lead guitars. One of them is kind of a normal metal lead, and then the other one is a weird kind of synth pad in a sense, but it's a guitar with an EBow, which I bought and tried out for this album, and I liked it. And so that is a very delay heavy, washy guitar with an EBow, and I had to learn how to use an EBow and record this, and it was fun. It was cool to layer in there these different aspects. And yeah, that was an extra lot of guitars. So there's the 2 rhythm guitars, and then 2 clean electric guitars, 2 acoustic guitars, and then the 2 lead guitars. So that's a lot. And then the bass too. So 7 total guitars, which is an important number conceptually for this album. So it makes sense. Likewise with the vocals, most of it is in 2 and 3 part harmony. And sometimes they're simple things like octaves apart, but a lot of the times I've got 2 different melodies going on, or got the melody and a reasonably complex harmony. It's not anything too crazy, but I did try to add as much extra harmony and melody in the vocals, which were kind of going on last, even though I was aware of what the vocal melodies were going to be before I wrote the album. So let's go back to that. The writing. I started with the text here, the Book of Revelation, and I went through and I basically copied and pasted all the sections that I thought would end up being cool lyrics for a song. And then from there, I cut it down and I refined it and I made sure that it was going to work. It was different writing it, because I started with the lyrics and then I sat there with my guitar, kind of like a singer-songwriter or something, which I don't do, and played chords and stuff with the lyrics and kind of sang and jammed out some riffs until I came up with something that was cool enough. And I recorded that right away. And I just got through the whole thing that way and wrote an hour worth of music with just the guitar. I don't think I recorded any of the scratch vocals. I had the scratch guitars, and they were just simple, heavy rhythm guitars, and the clean parts I think I did as well, because they're pretty important. So I had a lot of those. I believe that next I recorded some scratch vocals and then started working on the drums. Now I had some basic things programmed out, but I really didn't put a whole lot of time and effort into programming the drums, because they were just going to be scratch tracks to work with, and I didn't want to get too attached to them or too set in them. They were just there to help me write the guitars and make sure that the riff would sound cool with some kind of drums. So the drums were all acoustic, and I just came up with the parts at the kit with the scratch guitars and played stuff until it was comfortable and I liked how it sounded. A lot of the writing for this album was a continuation on my previous EP in this vein, Scattered Like Ash, which was another one in this kind of melodic, melancholy, doom type sound. And a lot of my goal with it is to be slow and heavy and simple. I didn't want this to be a technical Doom record, if such a thing exists. I didn't want it to be flashy, but I didn't want it to be boring either, and so simple that it felt unoriginal and bland. I tried to come up with an interesting interplay between the kick and the snare parts. And it's nothing technically advanced. It's pretty simple and easy to play most of the time. But I wanted it to be interesting. I wanted it to be different and fit the music and write some unique patterns. So it was good to actually challenge myself to not show off or play anything flashy or fancy, but just play simple rhythms. And it also made recording easier because, as I said, I was recording acoustic drums and I didn't want to have to edit everything. My goal was that I wouldn't have to edit anything at all. And I ended up editing everything beat for beat, the entire album. And that took me probably 20 hours, maybe, I guess. It was a long time. It really forced me to get good at editing acoustic drums, which was another benefit. However, I'm never doing that again. I can do a song here or there without going crazy, but doing a whole hour-long album with, a lot of reasonably fast songs and fills and stuff. I mean, it's not all slow. There's a lot of blast beats and stuff, and editing that is a real slog, but it was much needed practice, I guess, that hopefully next time I have to do something like that, I'm getting paid well for it. Because, that's why I have an electronic kit, because editing MIDI is a lot faster, and there's no way I'd be writing as much music as I do if I had to edit acoustic drums all the time. Maybe I would just never edit anything. That's another option. But, people expect drums to be tight. People want that sound. That's the sound of modern metal. And I want it to be tight too. I mean, I thought maybe I could get away with just keeping it totally unedited and natural or doing some minimal editing. But every time I tried editing a section and comparing it to another repeat that wasn't edited, I just like the edited version so much better. And, I'm not John Bonham who can just play without a metronome and sound awesome. Sorry, but that's true. And I'd rather that you and I both get to listen to something that sounds better, and that requires some editing, a lot of editing. It's very time consuming. I didn't really do any editing with the guitars. I would just re-record until I had a good take, and if I had to punch in a little section, that was okay. But I didn't really edit the guitars note for note. I never really do, because it's just faster to record a better take if I'm sloppy. Drums were harder because I was sitting at my kit on the other side of the room. I couldn't run back and forth to the computer and punch in a few bars here and there. But I did have a remote thing set up with Reaper. There's actually a local website you can go to on your local network. You just type in the IP address and it loads up a web page that has the record functionality, and you can skip to the next section. So if you put all your songs as a different region, you can skip back and forwards with the songs, and you can hit record, and you can change the levels on your phone. It's actually very cool, but it's not a perfect system, and it's also not the most responsive. And unless you're going to mark out regions for every part of a song, which you could do, it was just easier for me to record the whole song. And so I would just record the whole song several takes until I was feeling like I wasn't going to do any better, and then comp it from there. The vocals, I did a lot of editing and comping on and recorded them several times and then tuned everything manually. Because again, as much as I would get it to sound as good as possible without any vocal pitch correction, we're used to hearing things with pitch correction. So I tuned everything. It sounds better that way. And once again, I would listen back and forth, and yeah, every time I tuned it, it sounded better. Now, I am a stickler for not having that auto-tune robot sound. I hate it. It distracts me if I ever hear that in an album. It really bothers me. And I'm not talking about people like T-Pain, but if I If it doesn't sound like an auto-tune singer and all of a sudden there's this weird, half-step slide in there that's clearly a pitch correction bug that they didn't fix, that bothers me. So I take my time and I listen to things carefully and have to play around with the settings so things don't change notes too quickly and sound robotic and fake. The vocal correction takes a long time. I do it manually. It gets the results I want, but, many hours, especially when you've got 3 vocal tracks and they're all singing different parts, so you can't copy and paste your tuning from one to the other. You have to do everything manually. And if you're not very close to the pitch, you have to figure out what note you were trying to sing. And if you're way off, it won't sound natural and you have to re-record it. Auto-tune, which I don't use auto-tune, I just used the Reaper stock vocal tuner. But any kind of pitch correction is not a magic wand and it's not an easy thing. So I think people who haven't done it, who think auto-tune is cheating, well, maybe it is, but it's not easy. It's still a lot of work, and it's not like you just load it up on a track and it's perfect. No, it takes a good amount of finesse, and you still have to be pretty close when you're singing, otherwise you'll hear it, and sometimes you can't get around that. You just have to re-record a take. So with all that said, why did I want to re-record this and remix it? Well, acoustic drums have their limitations, and I was working with very cheap drum mics and a cheap drum kit. I had some okay cymbals. I put on new heads. I tried to get everything sounding as good as possible and did test recordings and all that, so it wasn't like I was just throwing it together. But acoustic drums still have their limitations. They have bleed, and there's no real way to get around that. Now, in order to get a powerful metal drum sound that cuts through big walls of guitars, most albums have samples replacing the snare and the toms and the kick. That's pretty industry standard. It's hard to not do that, and especially if you want a very clear modern sound. So I didn't want to do that. I wanted to use no samples, and I kind of did. Well, I literally did, but only in one place, the kick drum, because the kick drum, it was just hard to get the attack of it very clear without sample replacing it because of the bleed. As soon as I brought up the high end of the kick to really get that click coming through the mix, it would be really messy with cymbal and snare bleed. It just didn't sound very good. So I recorded my own kick drum. I did a number of hits, both soft and medium and loud, and I made my own samples. And then I sample replaced my own drum with my own samples, which I felt like was not cheating. I guess it is, but it's about the only way to get that metal kick drum sound. It's just really hard to do it without some kind of sample reinforcement or replacement. I think I left the original kick track in there. I just reinforced it with the samples, but might as well just be all samples. Still, I think it sounds more natural than if I was to use a kick drum from another drum kit, because this is the same mic, the same kick, same kit in the same room. So that was the only sample I did, but everything else, the snare and the toms, I didn't sample it, and you can hear it. They don't sound as good, and there's compromises that have to be made. If you love real acoustic drums and you hate samples, well, there you go. A whole album with acoustic drums and no samples, and the drums don't sound that great to me today. And I tried really hard to get them as good as possible, but I've also learned quite a bit about mixing in the last few years. Sure, that's also true. And this album definitely pushed me as far as mixing. I mean, from the start of Revelation, when I, began mixing it to what was released originally, I got a lot better at mixing. So the final product was already the result of a lot of learning. And then over the last few years, doing the stuff with YouTube, all of the different genres and the gear I'm playing around with, and just doing more and different mixes all the time, and pretty much mixing every song as a one-off mix. That's really been kind of a brutal grind of mixing to get, hopefully, to a point where I'm happy with my mixing, which who knows if I'll ever be, but I'm a lot happier now than I ever have been before, so that's good. For this new remix, I used the electronic drums. It's way easier, and I tracked pretty much the entire album in, I think, one day. I had a number of hours, probably took 4 or 5 hours. Maybe it was 2 days, I don't remember. But during the last year, or no, actually in 2022, I tracked all the drums again, and I still knew the parts pretty well. I changed up some stuff that I just wanted to do differently, but for the most part, I kept to the original drums by and large, and I wasn't worried about covering every exact cymbal hit and every tom fill exactly the same, but it's a very similar drum writing, and a lot of the parts that I liked, all the parts that I liked remained, and I made some improvements on how I thought it could be written better. And also, importantly, I was able to improve the drum sound immensely and not go crazy editing it. It was still a lot of work to edit an hour worth of MIDI drums, but far better than acoustic. And, you know, every song might take me 20 minutes rather than an hour or two. So a lot faster. And I used the Hertz Drums Raw pack, which are unprocessed. So again, sort of staying in the same vein. I also just wanted to have the flexibility to make the drum sound my own. So the drum samples are completely raw, and I did a video on that and how I mixed them. And so that gave me the opportunity to make the drums my own and do something, again, somewhat more natural, unprocessed. I mean, there's plenty of processing on the drums, don't get me wrong. So that was the only thing I actually re-recorded, was the drums. And that was a big enough project on its own because I had to re-record all the drums. I had to edit them all. And then everything was fully mixed from scratch. So I went back to the original production, and I just basically took all the plugins off except for the vocal tuning and started everything from scratch. The electric guitars had the amp tone baked in, so it was just a matter of doing what I wanted with IRs, so I could still have flexibility there, but the original amp tone was the one I recorded because I didn't take DIs, which always take DIs, especially if you're doing an hour-long album. All the vocal performances are the same. The bass, I did take DIs as well as a DI off the amp, so just the amp and pedal tone, and I may have recorded the cab. I didn't use it either way, and I think I ended up just using the DI, and maybe I used some of the amp track for the bass here and there, but mostly the clean DIs, which I then just used Aurora DSP's Mammoth on the bass this time. I still, as I always seem to do, especially on a big project, must have went through maybe 20 revisions or more of the mix for this album. And, you know, I mix it and then I check it in my car, and then there's always something. And this one was faster. The first time I released this album, I spent, it seemed like, a few months going back and forth, and who knows how many mixes I did of that, 30, 40 or something. I still did a lot with this, but it was not as bad, and I wasn't making as many drastic changes either. I wasn't like totally disappointed and just kind of starting over from scratch. It was just a process of refinement, but I spent a lot of time refining it because I want this time to be the last time I release this album. I don't want to come back in a year or two and remix it again. Don't let me do that. I've done enough with this album. You know, it's my baby, but it's time for it to go. It's always a stressful prospect, mixing something and then releasing it. For some reason, it's less stressful if I'm just releasing a YouTube video and it's just a song demo, and it's like, whatever, you know, if it's not a great mix. But as soon as it comes time to like put it on Bandcamp and Spotify, for some reason that matters more to me than YouTube, even though more people listen to it on YouTube than they ever do on Bandcamp or Spotify. Well, I hope this has been interesting. I guess if you're still watching, it has been. So I always think it's interesting to hear how other people work. And so hopefully you feel the same way. And I guess you do. If you're still here, you do. So thank you. And if you want to go support the immense amount of work that went into this, you can go pick up a copy on Bandcamp, and you can go check out the original. Just listening to it, listen to it on Spotify. Just listen to it. You don't even have to buy it. The money's nice, but it's not about that. It's about sharing what I've made with you. And obviously, it's been a labor of love. I've done it largely for myself, I guess, but also for you, for everyone. So I hope you enjoy it, and maybe you'll get a little something out of it that I have. I have certainly gained something from this album. So smash like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.